The following Patreon episode is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Here to tell you why it's important to become a patron is our favorite guest, Cam Mallow. Cam, why should they become a patron?
It's important to help bring more new episodes.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks, Cam. So if you want to become a patron, go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and become one today. We thank you in advance.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Excellent. I want to thank you so very much for coming out for this installment of our 2022 Winter Lecture Series. I want to thank those of you here also for masking up, helping to keep everyone safe in this era that we find ourselves. So I'm so happy to see so many of you. For many, this is the first time in literally 2 years. I've seen a lot of friendly faces, so thank you so much for coming out. Those of you tuning in, thank you so much for live streaming our video today. And the Winter Lecture Series, oftentimes we look at some of the long-standing myths and the enduring controversies and the contested memory about this battle and this war, this civil war. Well, I'm not really going to talk much about any of the controversies or myths or memories surrounding this battle. I'm not going to talk about some of the actions or inactions of certain generals. And here I'm looking at you, Richard Ewell and Dan Sickles, right? I'm not going to talk about any of the myths about the battle. And over there, I have a photograph of some shoes. I heard many of you talking in the audience what this slide was all about. I'm not going to talk about the actions or inactions of certain regiments or the post-war writings and reminiscence of some of the participants. And here I'm looking at you, Jubal Early, among many others. But what I want to do today instead is take a look at an interesting place that once stood right here at Gettysburg, a place that some people described as, quote, a magical, wooded wonderland, a place where fairy tales came to life, a quaint village of yesteryear with storybook people, a famous happy land of ferns, fountains, flowers, fairy tales, and fun. That's how some folks described it. Others, not so much. Others described it as a blight upon sacred soil, an intrusion, and an unwelcome intrusion upon hallowed ground. So yes, there is a little bit of controversy today as we talk about an interesting, unique place that once stood here at Gettysburg called Fantasyland. This was a children's amusement park that stood right here at Gettysburg. In fact, if we were to walk out the back doors of this building, this visitor center, we would find ourselves surrounded by this magical, wooded wonderland. It stood here for more than 20 years, right out behind the visitor center, stretching up toward what is today known as Parking Lot 3. Before I talk a little bit about the history of this interesting place called Fantasyland, I just have to ask those of you in attendance here today, how many of you remember visiting Fantasyland? Excellent. Oh, I see a good number of hands going up. Excellent. I'm hoping that perhaps after the program we could share some memories together. And those of you who were there but can't quite remember much, I'm hoping that this program might kind of, jog loose some of those memories. And for those of you watching online, tuning in, if you were ever at Fantasyland, go ahead and leave some comments there in our chat about what you remember best about this place called Fantasyland. Okay, so as you well know, Gettysburg in 2022 did not always look this way. There have been a lot of changes to this historic landscape over the years. A lot of businesses, homes, landmarks, even roadways that have come and gone at this place called Gettysburg. And many of these things were here long before we were ever born. Of course, Camp Colt, right? That large Army training base right there that stood on the fields where Pickett's men and Pettigrew's men and Trimble's men made that attack on July 3rd of 1863. This large Army training base, Camp Colt, stood 1917, 1918. You can see some of the photographs of Camp Colt. I always like the photograph on the top there. You can see the Pennsylvania Memorial in the background, just to give you some idea of where this was and what the landscape looked like just over 100 years ago. And of course, there was the Gettysburg Electric Trolley, whose trolley lines crisscrossed the battlefields, conveying visitors to the battlefield landmarks between 1893 and 1916. There was the Springs Hotel, which you can see up here on the top right, which stood on the first day's battlefield. The Shields Museum, which also stood along Route 30 on the first day's battlefield. You can see the monuments there to John Reynolds and John Buford. And more recently, there was a Stuckey's restaurant directly across from Sherfy's Peach Orchard. And in this photograph too, you can kind of see the observation tower that stands on Warfield Ridge in the distance. Now, there are a lot of things, a lot of changes though, that I do remember. When I was growing up, I grew up only about 2 hours away from here, a small town in Schuylkill County, and oftentimes my parents would bring me and my sister down. And I do remember staying one time at the Home Sweet Home Motel along the Emmitsburg Road. You can see that there, bottom left. I remember driving around Webb Avenue. Webb Avenue was a tour road that used to run right next to the angle on the third day's battlefield, Cemetery Ridge. There was a roadway there for vehicular traffic. I remember Battlefield Ford. Does anyone else remember Battlefield Ford on the first day's battlefield north of town? Large automobile dealership there. I remember going to the top of that tower. How many of you have been to that tower? Yeah, a lot of hands going up. I remember being really scared because I don't do heights from the top of that tower there. And I remember, of course, many, many times growing up, wandering around the old cyclorama and the old visitor center that stood just to the north of us. I do not, however, remember Fantasyland. Fantasyland vanished from the landscape here at Gettysburg just 1 month after I celebrated my second birthday in October of 1980. I don't remember it, but I have to tell you, I really had a good time researching this topic. It was something that I had an interest in, and it's just, hard to imagine that there was once, yes, this children's park right here at Gettysburg. So Fantasyland, it opened for operation in 1959, and it was in operation for 22 seasons before it finally closed down for good in October of 1980. At its peak, Fantasyland encompassed 35 acres, and it featured more than 100 attractions for children of all ages. We're talking about displays and rides and live performances. There were even trained animals that, believe it or not, reenacted the Battle of Gettysburg. And we're going to talk about that more specifically in just a little bit. Over the course of its 22 years in operation, Fantasyland welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors through its giant storybook entrance. It created a lot of happy and long-lasting family memories for those who remember coming here, especially when they were children. And today, well, again, it's hard to imagine that there could be a place like this right at Gettysburg. As you might imagine, located as it was, just to the south of the Soldiers National Cemetery, just to the east of Cemetery Ridge and George Meade's headquarters, Fantasyland did indeed generate a lot of controversy when it was being constructed and during its 22 seasons of operation. So how does this story begin? How does the story of Fantasyland start? Well, I think like any good fantasy book, let's start with Once Upon a Time, okay? Once upon a time, there was a family of 5, consisting of mom and dad and their 3 daughters. And in the summer of 1957, they decided to go on a beach vacation to the Jersey Shore, okay? This was the Dick family, Kenneth Dick, Thelma Dick, and their 3 daughters, Stephanie, Jacqueline, and Cynthia. Now, Dad Kenneth Dick was 40 years old that summer. He was born right here in Gettysburg in April of 1917, okay? Just 5 days after America's entry into World War I, Kenneth Dick was born here in Gettysburg. He grew up here. He grew up also in nearby Biglerville. He graduated from Biglerville High School, and during World War II, he served with the Marines for 3 years in the Pacific Theater of Operation, and he was wounded. He had shrapnel wounds at the Battle of Peleliu Island. A decorated Marine, served 3 years in World War II, came back home. He earned a bachelor's degree in marketing from Franklin and Marshall College. He was also a talented musician. He formed a band that would tour locally in the 1940s and early 1950s. And he also started a family with his wife, Thelma Hughes. She was from Lancaster and a graduate of Emerson College in Boston. The two were married in 1940, and they raised 3 daughters. Personally, daughter Jacqueline remembered her father as always being quick with a smile, a hard worker, and a very kind and loving dad who appreciated the beauty in things. They settled in in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And in Carlisle, Kenneth Dick became a very successful salesman. He sold international harvester heavy equipment for earth moving and road building. But life would take on a new direction for the Dick family during that beach vacation, because on the way home, they pulled into a recently opened amusement park in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey, near Atlantic City, called Storybook Land. So they pulled into Storybook Land. By the way, Storybook Land is still open today in operation. There's some photographs I gained from their website. They pulled into the children's amusement park there, and it seems that the 3 girls had a fun enough time. But Storybook Land might have been a little underwhelming to Kenneth and Thelma Dick. According to family lore, Thelma Dick repeatedly said, "Yeah, this is okay, but I could do something so cute, and I could do better than this." Kenneth Dick was on board with the idea and immediately said, "Well, let's do it." There was a 4-hour car ride home from Storybook Land to home in Carlisle, and during that 4-hour journey, it seems that they talked about the layout, the design, the marketing, and the location for their own children's theme park. And where should it be located? This was something they discussed at length. Certainly, it should be somewhere that drew a lot of people, a lot of visitors. So what about Lancaster? Certainly, there's a lot of tourism there in that area. But what about Gettysburg? It was, after all, 1957. At this point, there were a lot of folks coming to Gettysburg, and there were expected to be a lot more people coming within just a matter of years. The centennial of the American Civil War was but a few years away, as was the centennial observation of the Battle of Gettysburg in 1963. So after some back and forth, some research, and further planning, Gettysburg eventually won out. The battlefield, as I said, attracted at this point about 1 million people per year, and it was ideal, thought Kenneth Dick, because, as he later explained, quote, "Parents bring their children to Gettysburg, and they will climb on the cannons and run across the field." I hope they didn't climb on the cannons. But apparently they did. We don't do that anymore, right? But then, after about an hour, said Kenneth Dick, they'll be asking, what else is there for us to do? Fantasyland, this themed amusement park, well, it was something designed that would give kids that something else to do while they toured and visited Gettysburg. And there are some images of what this place, Gettysburg, looked like circa 1960s, 1970. So while the idea for Fantasyland was born in early 1957, or that summer in 1957, it wasn't until 1959 that financing was secured and construction began. In January of that year, Kenneth and Thelma Dick purchased adjoining properties of Roy Apgar and F. Harmon Forney totaling about 40 acres along the Town Road, just south of the National Cemetery. So in this photograph here, this photograph, by the way, is an aerial image that we'll see a little bit later on, but this was taken in 1968. Just to give you an idea, this is the National Cemetery. You can see Meade's headquarters a little bit to the south, and the property that Kenneth and Thelma Dick purchased was adjoining land that stood right here along the Town Road. So right now, folks, you are sitting in the theater just about right here. All right, just to give you an idea of where you currently are. Plans for Fantasyland 1863, that was the original title of this place, Fantasyland 1863. They were published in area newspapers. It would be, said the Carlisle Sentinel, an unusual type of park. There would be a 20-foot tall mother goose, a medieval type castle, and other such attractions. Santa's Village would be there with 10 different shops, a miniature golf course. The hope was to have this park open for Memorial Day in 1959, but they fell just a little bit behind schedule, and it would not open until mid-summer, again, 1959. Now, when word began to spread about this children's amusement park opening at Gettysburg, the response from preservationists and from historians, as you could imagine, was one of outrage. And as you might imagine, they were appalled at this idea, and criticisms to the proposed park were many. Gettysburg, they contended, was already way too over-commercialized. They argued, and a playland certainly had no place at the site of one of the world's greatest battles, and America's bloodiest battle of America's Civil War. Many called upon the federal government to step in and put a stop to this. If not, opined one commentator in April of 1859, then soon, quote, General George Meade's ghost will walk out from the headquarters and behold a fantasy land, fabulous, magical, wonderful, make-believe, with a miniature golf course. Now, Kenneth and Thelma Dick, they persevered in the face of this mounting criticism. They had gained a lot of local support for this idea. And reading the criticisms, okay, especially at a national level, Kenneth Dick, at last, he responded. And he wrote a pretty strongly worded letter that appeared in June 1959 in the New York Times. And the letter read, at length, quote, "We are building Fantasyland in Gettysburg. Yes, there is construction ahead, construction of a beautiful, clean, storybook land of make-believe. It will be a fabulous place and a credit to this community. Here, my children, we have 3 darling little girls, and yours, who are too small to understand the Civil War, will have something to do and see." End quote. He defended the location of the park, stating that it would, quote, "not be seen from Cemetery Hill. We cannot be seen from the cemetery," he wrote. "We cannot even be seen from the observation tower just next to the cemetery." And that wasn't the tall Otenstein Tower. There was a tower that once stood on Cemetery Ridge at some point. "We are way back off the road," he wrote, "in a beautiful forest. There was no combat there. It was a land used only as a bivouac site and a staging area. We voluntarily used restraint in our plans and are staying back in the woods where there is a beautiful stream and scenic beauty." Kenneth Dick would later state that most of the land upon which Fantasyland was built was, quote, "part jungle, part swamp," and that they only ever removed trees unless it was absolutely necessary. Now, Kenneth and Thelma Dick, they took offense to the thought that they were being disrespectful to history, and especially to the soldiers who fought and died. In response to that criticism, Kenneth wrote, "Mrs. Dick and I do not discount the history of this country, nor the historical significance of Gettysburg. That is why we went back off the road into the forest. I fought with the Marine Corps during World War II. I spent 46 months of my life with the Marines and was wounded during my 38 months overseas. I do not wear my Purple Heart and never have, but I do have a great respect for and a true understanding of a country's fight for survival. Are we going, asked Kenneth Dick, to buy the Pacific island on which I was wounded? Are we going to buy all the land on which Teddy Roosevelt fought? Of course not. We used restraint in our location of Fantasyland, so must the government use the same restraint. After all, Lincoln did not save this nation to have the government deny people their just rights. And really, to get all the battle land here at Gettysburg, the government would have to buy the entire town and most of the surrounding area. Building Fantasyland at Gettysburg, argued Kenneth Dick, is just the exercising of their inherent right. Quote, our great American privilege of going into business in this land of the free. For the Dick family, the wants of the many, they thought, outweighed the desires of a few. He wrote, it seems to me that anytime anyone wants to add something in this area, a few people want no competition. They start to yell and immediately pressurize the government to spend more of everyone else's money to stop them, to help them. The country is founded upon the competitive spirit of free enterprise, so why would all the taxpayers pay to protect the interests of just a few? Further, why should all the children be deprived of our education and entertaining Fantasyland for the few? Very strong letter written by Kenneth Dick, published in the New York Times in June of 1959. And just 1 month later, on July 18th, Fantasyland 1863 opened. And the Dicks really spared no expense in creating this world of make-believe. They traveled to New York City and Chicago to see storefronts, displays, and they hired top-notch artists to paint cabins, the signs, the entrance. The animatronic elves in Santa's Village, you can see them there on the lower left, they were purchased from Silvestri's Display Company in Chicago. And Kenneth Dick himself, he designed Rapunzel's castle, which we'll see, while contractor Donald Krause from nearby Fairfield, Pennsylvania, constructed many of the buildings. Truly, though, the creative mastermind behind Fantasyland was Thelma Dick. She sketched the designs for the layout of the park, for the structures and the attractions from Mother Goose to the Sugar Plum snack bar. She would also later oversee the landscaping and gardening throughout. And by most every account, it was truly a beautiful park nestled away in the woods with walking paths and 3 man-made lakes. Opening weekend was a tremendous success for the Dick family. Over 2,000 visitors arrived and entered on opening day. 5,000 arrived the next day. And when it was first opened, Fantasyland was 23 acres of size. It would grow to 35 acres. So what did one find when you first entered Fantasyland? This wooded, wonderful land of make-believe. Well, visitors entered through a 5-foot-tall doorway in a giant storybook. Right there is the entrance to Fantasyland, and you would pay based upon height. If you had to duck to get through that door, you paid the adult rate. If you were able to just pass on through, you were charged at a child's rate. And immediately when you entered Fantasyland through that storybook entrance, you were greeted by this 20-foot-tall Mother Goose. There she is over there with her giant gander standing next to her, and she would actually speak to each and every visitor. There was a booth next to Mother Goose, and there was an employee who sat in that booth and watched as families came and children came, and they would speak into a microphone, and it would sound as though Mother Goose herself was speaking directly, individually to these children. Pretty neat, right? I don't know. I mean, I might have been a little scared by that, but, but still. If you were small enough, you could then make your way over to the old woman's shoe. Okay, apparently she found something to do because she wasn't there. You could climb up a slide and go down a slide that exited from the front toe of her shoe. In Santa's Village, elves could be seen at work, making toys and Christmas goodies. Some children actually got to meet Santa Claus himself at Fantasyland when they visited. There were costume characters found throughout. Raggedy Ann and Andy, Wee Willie Winky, and Bimbo the Clown. Rapunzel's castle overlooked a lake where ducks and geese swam. Nearby the lakes was the Sugar Plum snack bar and a gigantic lollipop tree. The house that Jack built was there, as was Humpty Dumpty. There was a zany zoo where children would be able to see the real Peter Rabbit and Mary's little lamb. There were animals of all sorts there, including mice and monkeys. And during its first 3 weeks of operation, an estimated 21,000 people visited Fantasyland, a number far surpassing anything that Kenneth and Thema Dick expected when they opened this park. And among the 21,000 that opening summer, well, there was Susan, Mary Jean, and David Eisenhower. Of course, Dwight and Mamie's grandchildren, who said they had a whale of a time and they hope to return often to Fantasyland. So Fantasyland opened in 1959. It was 4 years after Disneyland opened in California. And just like Walt Disney's vision for his park, Fantasyland would never stop growing, okay? There would always be new attractions and new rides added to this place. Some of the new rides that arrived over the years included the Cannonball Express, and you can see that there on the top left. Every now and then, the Cannonball Express was driven by Bimbo the Clown himself as it took you around the park right through a 14-foot tunnel. There was a 36-foot tall carousel with white horses decorated in gold and jewels. A Swiss sky ride, 50 feet high and 1,300 feet long, carried guests over the park, right over the head of Mother Goose, over the castle, over the fairy pond. That opened in 1965, and in 1970, you can see on the bottom right, there was a dark ride added, a Disney-esque dark ride called Winter Wonderland. They would pump in air conditioning to make it feel as though you were skating your way across frozen mountains and lakes. There, again, gumdrop benches, leprechaun apartments, and in 1963, a gigantic 22-foot tall Mr. Musselman. You can see him there on the top right. He arrived at the park, and you could learn all about apples if you went inside. Actually, if you pushed a button nearby, Mr. Musselman would flex his muscles. Yeah, pretty neat. Now, the following year, in 1964, and I don't have a photograph. Oh, by the way, there is the Donut Derby. And that looks like a lot of fun, right? You can see there are some characters unique to Fantasyland. There on the top left, we have Panda the bear. This is Reginald the dog. And that is Freddy Frog back there, taking a spin around the Donut Derby. In 1964, capitalizing upon America's great love for all things Western at that time, Fort Apache, a log fort was added inside Fantasyland, and guests would oftentimes find themselves in the midst of attacks. They would have employees dressed up, if you will, in Native American attire, and make a charge upon this Fort Apache, and at points they would literally set parts of it on fire. A fire truck driven by a clown arrived. The hose came out to extinguish the flames on this make-believe fort. Now, at the Sugar Plum snack bar, if you were hungry, you could always order a Humpty Dumpty burger, and you could watch the young skippers pilot their own boats on those man-made lakes. And those man-made lakes are the reasons why my feet always get wet when I'm presenting interpretive programs under the tents behind the building. Especially Tent 2, when I give the Care of the Wounded program out there. Elmer the Scarecrow arrived, Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella. And each spring, before Fantasyland opened for the season, there would be thousands and thousands of tulips and hyacinths and daffodil bulbs planted. The Easter Bunny was oftentimes there for opening day weekend. And in 1961, Fantasyland began offering live performances. They had plays. In fact, that year they had a production called Young Abe Lincoln, but apparently it did not draw the crowds that they had hoped, and it wrapped up a little early. But they did offer other kinds of puppet shows. Jack and the Beanstalk, Rumpelstiltskin, The Frog Prince were all long-running puppet shows offered daily at Fantasyland. And in 1973, Abraham Lincoln returned to Gettysburg. There was an Abraham Lincoln impersonator named James Getty, who you may know, who was a teacher in Ohio. He would come and perform as young Abraham Lincoln in the summertime at Fantasyland, beginning a long association with this place. There were those trained animals, those trained live animals I talked about earlier, rabbits and chickens mainly. Sometimes they played baseball, sometimes basketball, but there was also Professor Punch, a rabbit, and Miss Judy, a chicken. And these were trained animals who put on a reenactment of the battle. So apparently there were cannons opposing each other that fired ping pong balls at each other. And the chicken would come out, would hit the button, ping pong would be fired at the rabbit, who would then come out, hit the other button, and fire back. I think one of them was either wearing a blue or gray hat as they did this. Now, for a better look at Fantasyland, here's that aerial photograph I talked about, and just to point out some of the landmarks that we're all used to. In the top left of the photo, you can see the old Cyclorama building, and you could also see Hancock Avenue and Webb Avenue. Again, there's that roadway that went right up to the angle. You can see Camp Colt, the community behind the Emmitsburg Road, is still growing. The old Howard Johnson Hotel is standing prominently there along the Emmitsburg Road. And this is Fantasyland, okay? So this is the Taneytown Road, and you entered Fantasyland just about the same place where you entered the Visitor Center today from the Taneytown Road. Here's a little blow-up of the park. So if we go up top, here is the entrance, and just about where Lot 3 stands today is the parking lot. This building right here is that gigantic storybook entrance that you pass through. Might be difficult, but here is Mother Goose, who would welcome folks to the park. There is Rapunzel's castle, and here are the man-made lakes where you could take a boat out for a ride. I believe the Sugar Plum snack bar was now nearby. So yeah, that stood right here. This is the Fry Barn along the Taneytown Road, and all of these homes, of course, no longer stand along the Taneytown Road. Now, there were some trouble spots along the way, okay? There was some misfortune about Fantasyland. Early on in operation, the ducks and the geese that were brought in flew away. They escaped. And once, escaping from the Zany Zoo, a monkey. And he was rounded up by police over here in the Camp Colt area of Gettysburg. But most notably though, in 1968, Mother Goose herself went up in flames. There was an electrical short inside the head of Mother Goose. It created a spark. It ignited her head, and there was nothing that could be done. The Gettysburg Fire Company came out to extinguish the flame, and there's the original Mother Goose on the left. One, firefighter, wiseacre or wisecracker, if you will, he told the Gettysburg Time that her goose was cooked. Nothing could be done to save Mother Goose, so they did put a new head on Mother Goose, you can see on the right, and I think visitors who arrived prior to 1968 and then after 1968 were probably surprised to find Mother Goose got a makeover, right? Now, in an editorial, there was those criticisms persisted. As we talked about earlier, it wasn't just when the park was being designed and talked about, but throughout its operation, there was repeated criticisms of Fantasyland. And this is Gettysburg circa 1950s, 60s, 70s. There was an editorial that appeared in Kiplinger's magazine, and Fred McCreary decided to write about the tourist areas that were springing up around all of America's national parks. Okay, this was something that alarmed Ms. McCreary, and he wrote about it, and he wrote, quote, "What are they really like today? The places that your kids read about in school and which you hope to show them sometime as the finest representations of the American spirit. In case you haven't looked lately, a shock is in store. Marvels like Yellowstone Park and Gettysburg Battlefield are infested often within their borders and almost always around the edges by a spreading disease of our time, tourist blight. It's more a sickness of an era, he said, marked by mobility and leisure. The manufacture of tourist blight is also a lucrative business. Competition is keen among those who cater to and exploit the simplest expressions of public taste. Now, he says, Coney Island is one thing. It serves a delightful purpose, aflutter with pennants and sideshows and mistaken for nothing else but itself. So does Atlantic City, for those who like to walk the boardwalk and Steel Pier, feeling content in company of loud signs, loud noises, and throngs of people. But this is hardly the atmosphere to spread from one coast to another, hardly an appropriate symbol to find at the gateway to or within a national shrine. Of course, everyone is entitled to his own taste and should pursue it freely, but the public landscape, which all of us must live with, deserves far-sighted care, and our national monument should be more than an opportunity for promoters to make a fast buck. Perhaps the surge of the last decade to lay waste to large sections of the countryside owes its inspiration to the success of Disneyland. Walt Disney built a synthetic thing, ballyhooted on television, and proved that millions of families would come running. Enterprising, the hopefuls copied some of the Disney image, playing up to public interest in history, the American West, nature, patriotism, and religion. In almost every part of the country, often adjacent to a national park or monument, drawing millions of visitors, are places such names as Fantasyland, Six Gun City, and even Bible Land. Now, McCreary highlighted some of the tourist blight, as he called it, that emerged at several national historic parks. Here is, in part, what he recorded of his recent visit to Gettysburg in 1962. No matter how you approach this hallowed ground, the route is lined with signs leading to extraneous commercial attractions. On the west, the Chambersburg Road, which Lee followed en route to his fateful battle, there is an Indian village, complete with totem pole and teepees. It is labeled, quote, authentic, although Indians have not been in the area since 1750 and never did use totem poles or teepees when they were here. On the north, the road from Harrisburg, near the place where General Jubal Early's forces smashed Union defenses on the first day, there is a horse and buggy museum, variously and modestly advertised as America's largest, and the world's largest collection of horse and buggies. But to be near is not enough. The new Howard Johnson Motel advertises happily that it is, quote, practically in the center of the battlefield, inviting guests to experience the art of pleasant living only a few hundred yards from the fields of Pickett's Charge. Then there is America's most beautiful land of make-believe, a place called Fantasyland, with monkeys and Mother Goose right in the center of things, facing General Meade's headquarters just below the National Cemetery. Now, this is one of the articles that was printed. Newspapers throughout the country, magazines began to reprint McCreary's editorial about what was happening around parks. But despite the criticisms that were continually leveled against it, Fantasyland continued to draw tens of thousands of visitors, year after year, season after season. And when I was looking back through the newspapers about Fantasyland, there were schools from Ohio, Maryland, Pennsylvania, of course, that would just send children here on field trips to the battlefield, but also include a trip to Fantasyland as well. Cub Scout groups, Girl Scout troops making their way. And two children who had a blast at Fantasyland repeatedly were John Kennedy Jr. and Caroline Kennedy, the President Kennedy's children, who visited Fantasyland no fewer than 3 times in the summer of 1963. That once they even brought their mom, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, with them. Now, of their first visit, May 20th of 1963, the Gettysburg Times reported, quote, the Kennedy youngsters enjoyed the antics of a chimpanzee, which John Jr. called a chipmunk. And they slid down slides, and they took numerous rides on the Civil War train and merry-go-round. Caroline Kennedy told attendants at the park that she loved it and plans to come back again. During that same visit, when the Kennedy children were there at Fantasyland, Ann Eisenhower, Ike and Mamie's granddaughter, was working that summer in Fantasyland. And as it turned out, the Secret Service agent, Robert Foster, who was accompanying the Kennedy children, had once been assigned to Ann Eisenhower. So it was a remarkably small world for Mr. Foster there. Apparently, Ann Eisenhower was the voice that day of Mother Goose when the Kennedys came through the door. She delighted the Kennedy children. They were back a few weeks later. This time is when they brought their mom. The Gettysburg Times said, quote, "The first family toured the park for about 2 hours yesterday, from 3:30 p.m. to near 5:30 p.m. In spite of their nationwide fame, it was not until they had completed almost half their tour before the Kennedys found themselves being followed by a sizable crowd, but even then at a respectable distance. The children's excitement at being there was clearly evident, according to spectators. Mrs. Kennedy often found herself being pulled in opposite directions at the same time by John Jr. and Caroline. The children found a slide into a pile of hay and they found it delightful, and they rode that train, that 1863 train around the park. Now, Zippy, the chimpanzee, was brought out by Kenneth Dick, but then he realized that Ann Eisenhower wasn't working that day, and Caroline wanted to see Mother Goose. So, not wanting to spoil the magic for young Caroline, Kenneth Dick himself went into the booth to provide the voice of Mother Goose, and apparently he tried to adapt a high falsetto, and it didn't quite work. Now, the third and final visit of the Kennedy children came in mid-June, just 6 months, sadly, before their dad was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. So in 1974, 1974 is when the highly controversial 300-foot Ottenstein Tower, that big tall tower I spoke of earlier that many of you remember, it opened at Gettysburg just to the northeast of Fantasyland. The construction of this tower renewed, if you will, the criticisms leveled against Fantasyland from historians and preservationists. And one editorial, it was published in the Tyrone Daily Herald, he deplored the opening of this tower, It read in part, quote, "A gaudy, sightseeing tower for tourists now dominates the Civil War battlefield where Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous address and where thousands gave their last full measure of devotion. The erection of this 307-foot monstrosity is not the first incursion of blight onto that hallowed ground. It is blighted too with a, quote, honky-tonk strip of fried chicken and roast beef sandwiches, drive-ins and fantasy lands with giant plastic dwarfs that the MPS had already allowed to encroach on the main path of Pickett's charge and within yards of Lincoln's immortal address." But 1974, the same year that that big tall tower opened, was also the beginning of the end for Fantasyland. In early April of that year, it was announced that Kenneth and Thelma Dick sold Fantasyland, the land, to the federal government. The cost for the land was nearly $1.4 million. And this, said daughter Jacqueline, was simply too much money for her parents to pass up. So $1.4 million is what was paid for by the federal government for Fantasyland. And it was purchased under the government's new, quote, opportunity purchase program. And this was a program that incentivized owners of historic land to sell it to the government and at the same time still enjoy occupancy rights for a period of time, for up to 10 years. So in 1974, the NPS took immediate possession of the land, but Fantasyland was allowed to continue to operate for up to 10 years, retaining its trade name, displays, amusements, and equipment. You can see a signing ceremony over there on the right from the Gettysburg Times, and here's another photograph of Fantasyland. This is closer to us. I mean, this is what it literally would have looked like if you walked out behind the visitor center today. Kenneth Dick, he maintained that if and when, he said, the government asks us to leave, we'll simply pick up Fantasyland and move it to another location beyond the NPS boundaries. And the Dicks also agreed to continue paying property taxes over the next 10 years, which went far in pleasing commissioners and local residents who were angered by the potential loss of this tax base. Fantasyland opened for its 16th season just a few days after the sale was announced, and visitors continued to come. And for the next 6 years that ensued, it remained a very popular place with visitors young and old, and the reason why might have been explained in a 1975 article that appeared in the Hanover Evening Sun. Quote, "What makes Fantasyland an annual family favorite? It is unique among parks in that it appeals to all ages. It has something rare to offer everyone, and there is always something new to see and do. Hidden away in the rich farmlands of southern Pennsylvania, Fantasyland offers an excellent spot for relaxation and appreciation of natural beauty. Following a path through Fantasyland's 35 lush acres, an adult visitor forgets daily cares, and a child discovers another world, the one of imagination. Anyone who has visited this unusual park can explain their reasons easily. Its rich natural beauty, joyous surprises, and smile-filled acres present the panacea to today's headaches and worries," end quote. Now, to the surprise of much of the general public, Fantasyland came to an end suddenly in the fall of 1980. Now, the terms of the sale with the MPS meant that Fantasyland could remain in operation through 1984. But after that deal was reached, Kenneth and Thelma Dick began to advertise their rides, their attractions in trade journals, and they would get a buyer. During the end of September and October of 1980, reports about the closure of Fantasyland began appearing in local papers, even though it was initially denied by Kenneth and Thelma Dick. Then on October 11th, 1980, October 11th, an article appeared in the Gettysburg Times that let it be known that, quote, "Mother Goose, Johnny Appleseed, and Snow White, all Gettysburg residents for more than 20 years, are moving to Ohio." Sports Paradise Incorporated. Sports Paradise Incorporated bought just about everything from Fantasyland. The rides, the displays, the amusements and attractions, just about all of it, from Rapunzel's castle to the Sugar Plum snack bar to Mother Goose herself. Everything was purchased by Sports Paradise Incorporated. And the plan, the owner at that time was a fellow by the name of Philip Fry. He planned to move everything, literally by truck, across Pennsylvania and open up a brand new place in Ohio. Okay, that was his plan. 300 miles to the west of us in New Concord, Ohio. The total amount for the purchase was not initially revealed. The down payment was $26,000 down payment for the purchase of all of Fantasyland's rides and so on. A spokesperson for Paradise Park said the plan was to dismantle Fantasyland and have it all shipped by tractor trailer by the end of the year. Locals, and especially local children, well, they were devastated by this news. It was so sudden. And this was a place where they went to every year, year after year after year. It provided employment, seasonal employment for a lot of teenagers, for a lot of college-age students who were home that summer. On October 23rd, 2 weeks after the sale was reported, it was announced in the Gettysburg Times that the 26th, you can see it right there, October 26th was the last time, their final day of operations ever for Fantasyland. So come on out from 10 to 5 before Fantasyland is no more. For Kenneth and Thelma Dick, this date was surely a bittersweet one. For more than 20 years, Fantasyland welcomed and entertained hundreds of thousands of children of all ages. And they were on hand that day to greet visitors. Kenneth Dick was now 63 years old, and he later wrote, "We have mixed emotions. It's been our life." Now, they were looking forward to some quiet time, to having some more freedom after providing so much fun to others. They were looking forward to a little bit of fun themselves. So by the winter of 1980, 1981, ride by ride, attraction by attraction, Fantasyland literally vanished from the landscape here at Gettysburg. Not from the history of Gettysburg, but at least from the landscape. And these are some images from the Gettysburg Times, October 1980. We can see the Enchanted Forest sign coming down and a giant, I don't know, is that a pig or a fox? lying on top. We can see workers dismantling some of the rides, some of the attractions there. And I know many of you are probably wondering, well, Mother Goose herself was loaded onto the back of a tractor trailer for the long journey west. Many in the local community were saddened to see Fantasyland go. And one was Flo Woomer, okay? She wrote in December of 1980 a letter to the editor of the Gettysburg Times. And she wrote, "Dear Sir, there have always been things in particular during my lifetime that have brought tears to my eyes and a lump in my throat. When I read my Gettysburg Times today, it happened again. I will regret the loss of Fantasyland from the Gettysburg area. I have visited there many times. It was a special place to take a child. I found it to be a most beautiful and unique park. In my own personal opinion, it was enough to have it mentioned when riding the pink cars that an area of the park had played a part in the Civil War. It doesn't seem necessary to me that the entire park had to go when there is already so much land dedicated to the observance of the Civil War. There are plenty of grim reminders in regard to the very tragic war, which, she said, has been deemed by some historians as a most unnecessary one, a blot on the history of our great country. But since life seems to be a series of opening and shutting doors, I guess I will have to accept the fact of the removal of Fantasyland. It's a door that can never be opened again in the Gettysburg area. Sincerely, Flo Woomer." Touched by this, Kenneth and Thelma Dick penned a response, which appeared in the next edition of the Gettysburg Times. They said, quote, "We were extremely pleased to read the kind letter written by Flo Woomer in your paper. She talked about tears in her eyes and a lump in her throat when she thinks of Fantasyland closing. We felt exactly the same way when we read her warm words. We are also warmed by the number of people who have called upon us and stopped us on the street to tell us it is sad." That is the word everybody is using, sad, that Fantasyland is closing. While we are very sorry they feel sad, it makes us feel that maybe we were doing some things right. We had a very happy quarter of a century and hope we've made some other people happy too. Just as a postscript, by the way, Paradise Park or Paradise Lake opened to the public in Ohio in May of 1981, featuring many of the same attractions, the same rides, Mother Goose, as Fantasyland. And these are some photos I found on a Facebook page for Paradise Lake. But apparently, there's the Swiss Sky Ride, by the way, that once crisscrossed the skies over us. Apparently, Paradise Lake or Paradise Park had opened too soon. Wasn't quite ready, and it lasted just a few years before it went under entirely. What happened to all the rides from Fantasyland after that, I don't know. Some reports I've heard, or just kind of things I've read about, say theme parks in Indiana took some of it. Theme parks in Texas took others. But there is a strong belief among many amusement park aficionados that Mother Goose still stands to this day, that you could go visit her in where this story began, Storybook Land in Egg Harbor Township, New Jersey. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in here for this winter lecture. Thank you.